Every essay that you write, be it expository, persuasive, or research-based, should have an introductory paragraph, and W1a W2a Introduction explains what should be in that paragraph. Starting from the 1 level, a good introduction should, at the very least, have your claim. And of course, we talked about what makes a good claim in W2a W1b W2b. At the 2 level, and now we're actually getting into what makes a true introductory paragraph, you should have a hook for your reader. You should be able to define the topic of your essay, and then finally you should make a claim, and it should be in that order. The 3-level proficiency, your hook is actually engaging, and we'll talk about what makes a hook engaging. Not only are you defining your topic, you're also giving appropriate background information, and at the end, you're once again making your claim. At the 4 level, your hook is so engaging that it can connect to all humanity. All people will be able to find something to relate to within it, and then you are still defining your topic and giving your appropriate background information and making your claim. So I like to think of an introduction as a triangle, and as a formula, if you will, in that sense. You start with a broad hook that can connect to all people. It's going to connect just to the overall topic of your essay, not necessarily your specific claim just yet. Then you get narrowed down a little bit by giving the background information, which will lead into your very specific claim. So most specific is at the end, the very tip of your triangle. Least specific is at the top with your general hook that people can connect to. And that way you can draw them in with that very general connection. So some different types of general hooks. There are quite a few out there, so we'll have 2 slides of these. You could start with just a basic statement of the topic of your essay. And you don't want to say something like, this essay is about war. It needs to be a little bit more complex than that. And it can relate really even to the theme of the text that you happen to be talking about without going into what you're going to argue about in your paper. We'll see some examples of that soon. You could begin with a quotation. There's some great quote websites online. Just make sure that you explain its relevance, and also, of course, be sure to cite it. Anytime you use outside materials, you've got to make sure that you've got a citation for it. You could begin with a question. And I would encourage you to move beyond the basic, what is, whatever topic you happen to be writing about, make it a complex question. Because questions are frequently done, but they're usually done in that very simple pattern of, what is? See if you can push beyond that. Begin with acknowledgement of an opinion opposite your own. We know this as a counterclaim. Yep, you can even put your counterclaim in your introduction. You can start with it. And this is especially effective if the counterclaim is the more popular opinion. If you're arguing against the popular belief, use the counterclaim, what people actually believe, to lure them into your paper and then crush them with the rest of your work. You could begin with a short narrative. This is actually one of my favorites. I like story. I think humans in general like story. If you think about it, one of the first things that you do when you get to school or when you get to a new place and you see friends for the first time in a while is to share stories about what's been going on in your life. We really like stories. So if you can think of a story that connects to your topic, by all means start with it. Be sure, of course, to connect it. You could begin with an interesting fact. This will require a bit of research, and of course that will mean citing it if you find it outside. You could begin with a definition or explanation of a term that's relevant to your paper, especially if the topic of your paper is very complex. I'd encourage you to think beyond just using a dictionary definition. Those can be helpful, but they're kind of overdone. Define it yourself and think outside the box. You could also begin with an irony or a paradox, something that seems contradictory. Think of it as like a puzzle. People like to puzzle, so use that to your advantage if you have one that's appropriate. After your general hook, remember you're going to narrow down, get a bit more specific. If you're talking about a book or really any text, cross that off, it could be a poem, a movie, whatever. You should have the author's name, the title, the date of publication, and then brief, very brief, just 1 to 2 sentences, mention of the plot. All of those things should be present in the background information. If it's a more general topic, try to address the basic who, what, when, where, why. They may not all apply to whatever you have to be talking about, so choose what applies. Okay. Not necessarily all of them, but if you can get to all of them, by all means do. Finally, the very last thing I should see in your introduction is your claim. And of course, we've already talked about this in W1b, W2b, so if you need a refresher on that, go ahead and check that out. Okay, we're going to start our examples with the claims that we used in our earlier work, and I wanted to get those first things so that we could know what we were doing with our hooks. So we've already started working with 2 essays. Our persuasive piece is the American education system should include more vocational training to better address the needs of the modern student and economy. Our expository claim is Wilfred Owen's Dulce et decorum est, reveals the effects war has upon soldiers, both during and after battle. So we'll be working with examples for hooks with those 2 essays in mind. Okay. So first things first, if you wanted to go with a topic approach to a hook, you could say, for instance, the American education system is under constant scrutiny. So we're getting at the topic of the American education system. We're hinting that it is perhaps not perfect. If it's under scrutiny, people are looking to change things, and that will lead us nicely into our claim. For the war piece, war impacts all human life. So we're already starting to lead into how it might impact the soldiers, as explained in the claim. For the quotation, I had to go online here and do some research, and I have to make sure I had a citation for these at the end of the paper too. The great aim of education is not knowledge, but action, Spencer. And then, of course, you need to see how it are connected to your essay. But is this happening for all students? And that will be a nice lead into talking about the need for vocational education. It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it, Lee. And again, the connection, as generally reflected over 100 years ago, war is a paradox. So I'm even kind of pulling in on a secondary hook here, this idea of conflict and contradiction within this topic. More hooks. The question, remember we want to stay away from the basic what is the American education system truly preparing its students for the future? Again, a nice lead into talking about the need for change, more vocational education. Is war the glory films show, or is the truth more complex? Again, we're also getting into that paradox, showing that there's some contradiction here, giving 2 possible responses. Counterclaim. The American education system should hold the course set years ago and continue to prepare students for college. We can go on to give some statistics about why college is important before going into our claim that no, in fact, we need to change and bring in more vocational education. It is a great honor to serve and even die for one's country. Now, this is not a direct counterclaim, but we know that that poem is going to go on to talk about the negative aspects of war. And so when we get into the details in the body paragraphs of the essay, this will in fact be a counterclaim, this concept of the great honor. Okay. Narrative. This is totally made up here, clearly. John Doe. John Doe walked out of Smith High School for the last time when he was just 16 without his diploma. He wanted to study welding, but the program was no longer available. And this could go on to explain the negative impact that had perhaps on his life, and then merge nicely into we need vocational education for students like John. Army Sergeant John Doe was never the same after his time in Afghanistan and the loss of his best friend. Strong emotional appeal here in this hook. We're going to grab some hearts with that one, and that will be a nice lead into the negative impacts of war. An interesting fact, again, you got to do some research here, make sure you cite it. By 2018, nearly 1/3 of American job openings will require vocational training. You might recognize this if you've already taken a look at the details lecture. Yes, you can steal something that would have been a detail in your essay and use it for an interesting fact. Be sure not to duplicate it if that's the case. But this is a good fact to grab attention, and that's a pretty significant number. It is estimated that nearly 20% of soldiers who served in Iraq or Afghanistan have developed PTSD in a given year. Again, that's a pretty significant number that should be grabbing attention, and really true. This is only the people who have reported it, and there are probably more out there who haven't. You could go on and make that connection as you go further into your introduction. Giving a term, a good career is one which makes a person thrive both mentally and financially. It does not require a 4-year degree. We're also kind of building in some contradiction here. Notice this is not a dictionary definition, but I've got my is there, and I'm explaining what I believe a good career happens to be. One which makes a person thrive both mentally and financially. And that will be a nice lead into the need for all types of education, not just college prep. War, a mass of chaos, guns, sound, and fury. Notice this isn't even a complete sentence. I'm giving a sensory definition of war, and you could even go beyond that. That'd be a nice lead into, again, those negative impacts of war that are described in the poem. And the final one, a paradox, a contradiction. Education is meant to prepare students for their future lives, but in its current state, it is not. So we've got a contradiction between what currently is and what it should be. War is glory, war is pain. Two negatives. It shouldn't be both, and yet it is. Nice lead-in for our poem, especially because it talks about how people say it's so glorious at the end of the poem. So, examples of different types of hooks. Next up, background. For our persuasive piece, we're not dealing with the text. We need to go with our who, what, when, where, why as applicable. As far as who is involved in this particular topic, students, teachers, administrators, government officials, the people who would have the power to make the change, and the people who are the reason for the change. What needs to be a change in the education system? When? Now. As soon as possible, quite frankly. Where? In America, although you could argue that this is the case globally. Why? Needs are not met. Notice I'm not getting into super specifics of vocation because that's going to be my claim, but I do need to hint that change is needed. For expository, I need my author's name, Wilfred Owen, the title of the text, Dos et decorum est, date of publication, 1918, and then a very brief mention of the plot, a soldier recounts his experiences during and after a battle in World War I. I didn't say anything about how he reflected on those experiences yet because that's going to be made more apparent in the claim that's about to come after that. I want to give you one example of how a full introduction might flow with all those pieces that we've just looked at. So I pulled from what we've already seen to show you what it would look like with transitions in place too. This is for the expository piece. Quote, "It is well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it. As General Lee reflected over 100 years ago, war is a paradox, both glory and pain. The great general is not alone in his thoughts. Soldier poet Wilfred Owen also addresses the conflicting views of war in his 1918 poem Dos et decorum est, featuring a soldier recounting his experiences during and after a battle in World War I. Wilfred Owen's Dos et decorum est reveals the effects war has upon soldiers both during and after battle." So we've got our general hook that can connect to all people truly because, honestly, we've all been alive in some variety of war. That's just a human thing, unfortunately. So it connects to all, and we actually have several different types of hooks in there. We have a transition to help connect the hook into our background information. There's our transition, the general's not alone in his thoughts. Then we have our background information. Soldier poet Wilfred Owen also addresses the views of war in his poem, da-da-da-da-da. I even give the summary right in that long sentence. And then finally our clear claim. So one paragraph, not terribly long, but 3 important parts to make sure that a reader's interested in what you have to say.